We have spent so much of our lives reacting. We wake up and immediately react to the day's demands. We scroll through screens and react to curated moments of other people's lives. Our days are not lived. They are a continuous series of responses, triggered by external stimuli. We mistake reaction for action, believing that simply responding quickly is the same thing as truly living intentionally. This relentless cycle of response drains us, leaving us exhausted and constantly negotiating our emotional state with the demands of the modern world. The feeling of being overwhelmed, of carrying invisible weights, that is the weight of expectations. Expectations placed on our careers, on our bodies, on how we should behave in a relationship. They are heavy things, these unspoken requirements, pressuring us toward an impossible standard of perfection. We feel that if we fail to meet some perceived ideal, something crucial about who we are will crumble away. This pressure builds into a silent and intense internal critique, the fear of inadequacy. It is a deep, gnawing anxiety that whispers failures before they even happen, convincing us that the next mistake will be the final one. The mind becomes hyper-vigilant, constantly scanning the horizon for evidence of failure or criticism. We live in a state of permanent tension, always braced for the impact of disappointment. This constant state of defensive preparation is ultimately unsustainable. It burns resources, mental, emotional, and physical, that could be used for true engagement with life. What if we could find a way to slow down this cascade of reactions, to introduce an intentional pause between what happens to us and how we choose to respond? This space, that brief moment of stillness, is where genuine freedom resides. It is the radical act of reclaiming ownership over our inner self from the whims of external pressure. The goal, then, is not simply success, or even happiness in its truest form. No, the initial challenge is much quieter and far harder. It is to learn how to observe those expectations, the ones imposed by others, and perhaps most painfully, those we impose upon ourselves, and simply acknowledge them without immediately becoming entangled within their demands. The weight of expectation is a profound and relentless burden. It shapes the way we approach every task, every conversation, until it feels like our very identity rests on flawless execution. We spend so much time curating an image of competence for the outside world that we forget to be kind to ourselves. We mistake constant reaction for genuine action, simply reacting to an email, to a critique, to a missed deadline, feels productive because it generates immediate output. But this reactive life is exhausting. It leaves us feeling depleted, like batteries running on borrowed time. If you look closely at modern success, you might notice a pattern: endless urgency and the constant underlying fear of being found out, the fear of failure itself. This deeply embedded anxiety creates an almost crippling cycle. We strive for perfection not because we desire excellence, but because we are terrified of imperfection's judgment. And in this pursuit, we sacrifice stillness, depth, and genuine well-being. Consider Marcus. Outwardly, his life is a model of modern achievement. His career path is ascending, his routines are polished, his online presence screams success. He moves through the world with a kind of relentless energy that suggests he has all the answers. Yet, beneath this impeccably maintained facade, there is a persistent hum of exhaustion. It is not the fatigue of hard work. It is the deeper weariness of perpetual performance. We see glimpses into his private moments: a late night working on a project, an early morning routine designed for optimum efficiency. And then we witness the slightest crack in the armor, a moment of minor failure. Perhaps he misses a crucial detail in a presentation, or maybe he misspells one important term in a document meant to secure a major deal. These are small errors, insignificant when viewed from a distance, But to Marcus, these tiny slips feel seismic. They are not merely mistakes, they are evidence. Evidence of inadequacy. The spiral begins instantly. This singular error does not exist in isolation. It triggers an internal dialogue that is brutally self-critical. He starts replaying the moment endlessly, reviewing every micro-interaction leading up to it. Was his tone too abrupt? Did he fail to anticipate a necessary question? The scope expands rapidly. One misspelling becomes proof of general incompetence. A forgotten detail suggests a deeper flaw in his focus, perhaps suggesting a fundamental deficiency in memory or intellectual capacity. He begins questioning not just the outcome of the task, but the core value of his professional self. This is the perfectionist's dilemma, that the very pursuit of flawless excellence requires him to constantly judge and measure himself against an impossible standard. The system demands he be always right, always prepared, always perfect. And when he falters, even momentarily, the accumulated weight feels unbearable. He realizes that this relentless self-interrogation is unsustainable. It drains his emotional reserves faster than any physical labor ever could. This exhaustion forces a confrontation with a profound question. What does it mean to live well when better is always an unreachable horizon? It is in this state of intellectual and emotional near collapse that he finds himself wandering away from the polished efficiency of his daily life. His steps lead him not toward another meeting or a new target, but toward something forgotten. He enters a place defined by age, a dusty corner of a grand university library, perhaps, or an antique repository overflowing with accumulated knowledge and history. This space is overwhelming in its silence, and even more so in the sheer volume of discarded thought it contains. Endless shelves loom over him, packed with volumes that have witnessed generations of minds grappling with the same fundamental questions. How should one live? What is virtue? Where does true freedom lie? He walks through these aisles, enveloped by the scent of aged paper and forgotten wisdom. The physical weight of the books seems to mirror the intellectual pressure he feels within himself, a massive accumulation of ideas that demand clarity. Overwhelmed, almost paralyzed by the sheer scale of human contemplation, his pace slows until it is merely a drift. He reaches out, guided by some inexplicable impulse, and brushes against a worn copy of Philosophy. The book feels weighty in his hands, its cover soft with time, its pages yellowed like old memories. As he runs his fingers over the brittle material, something shifts within him. It is not an answer, but rather a subtle permission to pause. This moment, framed by the profound silence and the sheer quantity of ancient thought, acts as a gentle interruption to his self-critical loop. He is forced, for the first time in what feels like years, just to be, without needing to perform, without needing to optimize. And it is within this stillness that the seeds of an unexpected wisdom begin to take root. The dust hung heavy in the air, a fine gold curtain diffusing the weak afternoon light. Marcus found himself wandering through an aisle that smelled overwhelmingly of aged paper and forgotten thoughts. These shelves did not hold bestsellers or modern guides. They housed the weight of centuries, volumes bound in cracked leather, filled with script no longer common, ideas too complex for casual reading. He felt small, utterly dwarfed by the sheer volume of recorded humanity. The library was a tomb of brilliance, and it threatened to swallow him whole. Every shelf seemed packed not just with books, but with expectations of what he should know, what he ought to be thinking, what perfection looked like on printed type. He traced his finger along the spine of an immense tome, feeling the raised gold lettering smooth beneath his touch. It was a physical representation of knowledge, so vast it felt meaningless and overwhelming. He stopped before a dusty corner marked simply Philosophy. There, amidst volumes titled with obscure Greek letters and Latin phrases, he found a small collection that seemed older, quieter. His hand instinctively reached out, brushing away layers of accumulated dust from a slender book. It was worn beyond recognition. The cover was soft to the touch, yielding under his fingers like dry velvet. The title page was faded, but the craftsmanship spoke of time and deep thought. He opened it randomly, not seeking answers, but merely needing stillness. The pages were brittle, faintly foxed, smelling richly of vanilla and decay. He did not read a coherent argument. He simply let his eyes drift over the layout, the structured thoughts, the rhythmic deployment of logic that had weathered millennia. There was an undeniable gravity to it, a sense that here, within these decaying leaves, lay something profoundly enduring. It felt like stumbling upon a secret garden hidden deep within the chaotic city street. In the frantic rhythm of his modern life, the urgent clicks, the relentless demands of email notifications, the ceaseless performance of being capable, he had never allowed himself this kind of accidental peace. He was accustomed to reacting, always responding to the next thing that demanded his immediate mental energy. This silence, broken only by the occasional scrape of a custodian's cart in the distance, forced him into an uncomfortable state of suspension. The weight lifted slightly, replaced by a quiet ache, the realization that he did not know how to just be without processing or achieving. His internal critic, usually so sharp and demanding, began to falter under the gentle scrutiny of forgotten wisdom. He sat down on the floor in front of the shelf, cross-legged amidst the scent of old glue and dry ink, letting the monumental sighs of accumulated human insight wash over him. It was too much, yet strangely soothing. The sheer volume suggested that every great question had already been asked, perhaps countless times, by hands long turned to dust. He was merely participating in a magnificent, continuous conversation across time. This unintentional immersion became his classroom. Here, among the physical monuments of thought, he realized that true learning might not come from consuming information quickly, but from simply allowing himself to encounter it slowly, respectfully, and without the expectation of immediate personal benefit. The profound stillness demanded a reckoning with his own fundamental pattern, the constant state of reaction. He was addicted to stimulus, afraid of the quiet spaces where one might be forced to hear the whispers of their own unmanaged judgments. He spent an hour there, not reading for facts, but listening for patterns, the enduring human concerns that seem to repeat themselves across centuries. What constitutes a good life? How should one handle unexpected loss? Where does true personal agency begin and end? It was in the dust of this quiet corner that Marcus began to shed the brittle skin of his professional self. He wasn't there to find an answer, but merely to absorb the atmosphere of thoughtful patience. The books were not a measure of achievement. They were witnesses to endurance. The echo of the philosophy book was not a sound, but a presence. A profound stillness that settled deep within Marcus, disrupting the frantic rhythms of his modern life. He found himself standing amidst towering shelves, surrounded by voices long forgotten, knowledge gathering dust like fine, gilded pollen. His breath moved slower now. His fingers traced the spines of weighty tomes, each title whispering secrets of men who had wrestled with existence millennia ago. The overwhelming abundance was daunting, suggesting not answers, but merely more questions. He picked up a random volume. It smelled of dry paper and oxidized thought, the sweet, inevitable decay of wisdom. As his thumb brushed against the aged leather cover, something shifted within him. It was a moment of pure, unexpected quietude. The constant internal monologue that usually drowned out all reflection simply paused. He realized with a surprising jolt how much energy he expended merely reacting to other people's expectations he had adopted as if they were his own. This enforced pause felt strangely foreign, almost irresponsible. His whole life had been built upon immediate response, the quick reply email, the perfect presentation, the preemptive apology. To simply stop and contemplate was, in itself, an act of resistance against the demands of his schedule. But the quiet held him captive. He walked slowly through the narrow aisles, absorbing the sheer weight of human thought, the geometry of logic, the search for natural law, the ethical quandaries of a well-fed student arguing with a skeptical master. These men had wrestled with similar pressures. The pressure to be perfect, to achieve recognition, to fit neatly into established definitions of success. He found himself drawn to a particular section, books clustered around ethics and logic. He ran his hand across a stack bound in severe green cloth. The principles contained within these pages seemed remarkably unsexy, requiring nothing dramatic or flashy, only sustained attention. And yet, they held the key to releasing him from the exhausting performance of modern life. It was then that an invisible voice began to whisper into the space surrounding him. It did not speak his name or acknowledge his journey. It merely spoke principles. Principles about judgment, about assent. It introduced a startling idea that what truly troubles us is often not the event itself, but the story we immediately construct around the event. He stopped before an empty reading table, the silence pressing in on him, demanding absorption. He considered the statement again. The events, the late emails, the minor technical glitch, the misspelled word, were merely facts, indifferent and cold. They possessed no inherent power to damage a life, only his interpretation of them did. If a single misspelling could derail his self-worth, then his entire emotional infrastructure was built upon unstable ground. Subjective judgment masquerading as objective truth. This realization carried the shock value of falling in deep water. It required him to reevaluate not just what he believed, but how he had been trained to believe. He spent the next hour simply listening to these invisible echoes, allowing them to erode the rigid framework of his self-criticism. The voices were calm, steady, rooted in a profound understanding of human nature and its follies. They spoke of recognizing what lies outside our sphere of action, the economy's whim, a colleague's mood, even the weather itself, and simply acknowledging that indifference. The struggle became intensely personal. He was being shown how to unlearn years of conditioned reactivity. To react was natural. It was the mammalian default setting. But true freedom, these echoes suggested, was something learned, built moment by measured moment, requiring immense discipline against the current of instant anxiety. The realization that this internal restructuring would be painful, tedious, and continuous was perhaps the most difficult truth of all. The quiet of the library had been a momentary grace. Marcus stood amidst the dust motes and aged parchment, the lingering echo of an ancient voice whispering a fundamental truth. That trouble arises not from external occurrences, but from our internal judgments about those events. He held this idea like a foreign stone, heavy and uncomfortable in his mind. His self-worth, it seemed, was built upon a volatile foundation, a judgment that could be triggered by the smallest oversight, leaving him vulnerable to the perceived chaos of modern existence. This realization was profoundly unsettling. It meant that if he wished to find solidity, the battleground had to be within himself. He closed the book gently, not wanting to disturb the dusty peace, and found a patch of bare ground near a low shelf. He sank down onto his knees, adopting a posture of contemplation. The initial impulse was confusion. How could anything outside his direct control cease to matter? He needed a boundary. He reached into his pocket and drew a piece of chalk, finding a small area of smooth concrete floor. Slowly, deliberately, he began to draw two distinct circles. The first circle he labeled with the dust-smudged precision of a student, mind to control. It represented his thoughts, his intentions, his immediate physical actions, things that sprang entirely from within him. The second circle was marked equally clearly, not mine to control. This vast outer ring encompassed everything else. The judgment of his boss, the fluctuating traffic outside, the economy's unpredictable sway, even the general disposition of humankind. The difference between the two circles felt immense, almost paralyzing in its scope. The temptation was immediate and potent, to shrink the second circle, or perhaps to draw a line that claimed authority over what lay beyond his reach. But he remembered the quiet voice from the books. True peace, he sensed, did not come from controlling the periphery. It came only from accepting its indifference to him. This intellectual exercise was demanding, forcing a rigid separation between responsibility and worry. He mentally populated the inner circle with positive affirmations. His discipline, his response capacity, his commitment to steady action. Then he looked at the outer circle, feeling the familiar, instinctive urge to feel frustration, the desire to simply will the outside world into compliance. He stood up abruptly. A sudden noise pierced the stillness, a distant jackhammer or perhaps a muffled car horn passing by the library window. Instinct took over. His shoulders tensed, his breath hitched, and his mind immediately leaped across the chasm to the outer circle. He began to replay imagined scenarios, being late because of traffic, the annoyance of that irritating noise, the unfairness of wasted time. The physical jolt was proof enough. No matter how carefully he drew the two circles, his immediate reaction always dragged him back to the edge, into the realm of unknown stimuli and uncontrollable variables. He blinked slowly, watching the dust settle from his momentary panic. This external stimulus had exposed a deep vulnerability. The struggle was not simply theoretical, it was visceral. He realized that even in this structured exercise, his greatest opponent was himself, his innate habit of intellectualizing stress instead of processing reality. The true obstacle was accepting that sometimes nothing needed to be done at all. The lesson demanded a willingness to feel the uncomfortable ambiguity of what if without attaching immediate emotional significance to it. He stayed there for a long time, kneeling by the chalk dust. He watched his mind cycling through acceptable and unacceptable worries. Should he worry about what others think? No, that is external. Should he worry about failing at something minor again? Yes, but only if my effort was lacking. This process demanded an unprecedented level of self-awareness, a vigilance that felt more exhausting than the failures themselves. He started asking himself deeper questions. If accepting uncertainty was the path to peace, then how did one practice acceptance when every fiber of his modern, successful being screamed for certainty? Acceptance required not just understanding the difference between control and concern, but actively choosing non-reaction in moments of genuine stress or inconvenience. The internal monologue intensified. He began scrutinizing the very nature of attachment. Were they attachments to outcomes, to approval, to maintaining a perfect narrative about who he was supposed to be? The realization dawned with gentle, unsettling clarity. His struggle wasn't with accepting other people. It was with accepting the deeply ingrained, almost compulsive need for validation that defined him. His perfectionism was not a strength. It was merely the gilded cage of self-imposed judgment. The quietude returned, deeper this time, less fragile. The mentor's voice seemed to coalesce in his memory, no longer merely quoting principles, but offering guidance on the muscle of restraint itself. True mastery was not about building better structures for his life. It was about gently retraining a mind accustomed to constant reaction. It was learning to inhabit the present moment so completely that the future worried about, or the past regretted, lost all their immediate power over him. He stood up, dusting the chalk from his hands, understanding that this initial drawing of circles was merely the first, small footprint on an immense journey toward true internal freedom. We arrived at the edge of certainty. Marcus had traced the dividing line in the dust so many times that his fingers were worn, a demarcation between what he could guide and what spun away like smoke on the wind. He understood, theoretically, that emotions were merely judgments applied to unchangeable facts. But understanding and accepting were realms separated by an impassable chasm. The internal blueprint of his life had been built upon reaction. Every alarm, every email notification, every perceived slight had been a command. Act immediately. And this habit was far more deeply rooted than any single external stressor. The boundary felt stable enough in the cool library air, yet it trembled under the weight of simple existence. A sudden sound, a car horn blaring outside, or perhaps just the distant ringing of a phone that wasn't even his, made him flinch. His body recoiled before his mind had processed the stimulus. In that split second of reflex, all the careful structures he had built collapsed. He was instantly immersed in worry, worrying about his professional image, worrying about disappointing others, worrying about the possibility of failure itself. The noise, utterly neutral and random, had triggered an entire cascade of anxiety, proving that his true vulnerability lay not with fate, but with his own ingrained habit of emotional overreaction. The mentor figure's voice had been soft, yet impossibly loud in the echoing silence of the library aisles. He suggested that the struggle was not merely about accepting others, nor even purely about accepting external events. It was something far more fundamental and infinitely more difficult. It was a struggle to accept himself. To accept oneself meant confronting the self that was constantly demanding proof of competence, proof of stability, proof of deservingness. This acceptance required letting go of the self-imposed burden of perfection, of continuous achievement, of the need to be perpetually useful. Marcus looked down at the dust circle and saw not just two categories, but a vast constellation of attachments. He was attached to his title, to his impeccable record, to the admiration of his peers. These attachments were weights that pulled him constantly off balance. The practice demanded relinquishment. It meant choosing stillness over speed, choice over compulsion. It meant practicing neutrality when every instinct screamed for justification or defense. This letting go felt less like an act of will and more like a slow, aching surrender, a voluntary dismantling of the ego's carefully constructed fortress. He had to dismantle the belief that his worth was proportional to his accomplishments. The next steps required moving beyond mere understanding into disciplined action. He realized he needed practice against predictable minor shocks. He envisioned scenarios where things would go poorly, not to dread them, but simply to prove they could be endured. This process of premeditation, or Premeditatio Malorum, was harsh mental labor. Marcus sat down and started constructing negative possibilities. What if he missed a major deadline? The panic flared briefly, a tight constriction in his chest. But then the thought shifted. What is the actual physical consequence? He would feel disappointment, yes. He might face difficulty talking to a boss, but would he lose everything? No. His survival was not tied to one perfect moment. If he lost his current job or misplaced an important item, he would experience inconvenience and effort, but his core being, the self that remained when the accolades faded, would endure. The mental rehearsals stripped away the fear's dramatic edges, leaving behind a duller, more manageable reality. The future ceased to be a terrifying mountain of what-ifs and became a navigable series of steps. He began to understand that the emotional impact was always voluntary. It was the judgment he added to the event, the belief that failure equals disaster or mistake equals personal flaw, that caused the deep suffering. This internal wrestling match continued until his natural environment provided an unexpected reprieve. Marcus found himself sitting by a quiet body of water, the lapping of gentle waves serving as a counterpoint to the roar inside his head. The constant noise of modern life, the demanding emails and expectations he carried like heavy coats, seemed impossibly distant here. He stopped analyzing every ripple and merely watched them move. This was stillness not born of avoidance, but of acceptance. The core philosophical principle began to take root. Freedom is not the absence of difficulty. It is the capacity to observe difficulty without being swallowed by it. It was a practice of detached observation, turning moments of life into quiet data points for self-correction rather than emotionally charged judgments demanding immediate reaction. He started practicing this detachment in micro-moments. A friend commented on his slightly rumpled clothes. The old Marcus would have immediately felt defensive. "My outfit is fine, you shouldn't judge me." Instead, he paused. He noticed the criticism, registered it as a sound wave of judgment, and then questioned its source. Was this statement an irrefutable fact about him? No. It was merely the friend's momentary perception, filtered through their own opinions. The gap between what was said and how he chose to interpret it became his temporary sanctuary. This moment of pause created a ripple effect. By refusing the immediate rush to self-defense or agreement, he gained space. Space to breathe, space to consider, and most crucially, space for compassion, both for others and for himself. He understood that true mastery was not about constructing an impenetrable barrier against criticism. It was about allowing the critique to pass through him, like water passing over river stones, causing momentary friction, but leaving the stone untouched. The difficult work, he realized, lay in transforming this intellectual understanding into the muscle memory of daily living. Philosophy was not a wisdom to be acquired and shelved. It was a discipline requiring constant, exhausting repetition. He learned that life itself became the examination hall for his inner self-mastery. To live intentionally meant choosing to observe the reaction before making it. It was the profound difficulty of letting go not just of bad outcomes, but of the comfortable, destructive habits of emotional panic. The greatest struggle is rarely against the outer world. It unfolds within the quiet chambers of our own minds. We spend so much time trying to manage expectations, to prevent setbacks, and to secure approval from others, believing that stability lies outside ourselves. But what if true freedom is not found in preventing storms, but in learning how to endure them? For years, we have been taught to seek perfection, to optimize every moment, and to measure our worth by our achievements. This tireless pursuit creates a profound exhaustion, a deep weariness that settles into the bones of our being. We operate in constant reaction mode, mistaking frantic responses for meaningful action. Consider the nature of this modern noise we live within. It is not just the ringing phone or the overflowing inbox. It is the perpetual expectation to be on, to be available, and to always improve. This pressure creates a fragile self-image, one that buckles instantly upon encountering the slightest imperfection. We build our identity on immaculate performances, believing that if we falter once, everything will collapse. But every system that requires constant performance must eventually encounter resistance. It is in these moments of stumbling, of small failure, that we are forced to stop and look inward. To withdraw is not weakness. Sometimes it is the only way to find enough silence to hear a different voice. This necessary retreat leads us back to ancient wisdom, to texts dusted by time, volumes bound by forgotten thought. The journey into reflection begins with a profound sense of being overwhelmed. The sheer weight of accumulated knowledge, histories of failure and brilliance, becomes too much to process in the rush of modern life. We feel small against the vastness of human thought, realizing how little we truly know, and yet how intensely we fear appearing ignorant. It is within this overwhelming stillness that a subtle shift occurs. As we read these old words, seemingly detached from our urgent emails or critical deadlines, something fundamental begins to dissolve. We are suddenly confronted not with the difficulty of external events, but with the invisible architecture of our own minds. The great realization dawns. It is not the event itself that causes us distress. It is the story we immediately tell ourselves about the event. This distinction between the raw occurrence and the narrative judgment placed upon it is perhaps the most radical challenge to our modern understanding of self-worth. We mistakenly believe our value depends on maintaining a perfect, unwavering inner monologue, that if we merely think correctly enough, we will be okay. But this reliance is unstable, built solely on subjective judgment. The true battle therefore shifts from managing outcomes to mastering the immediate internal response. We must learn where our personal power ends and whose it begins. This ancient discipline asks us to draw a clear line in the sand, or perhaps in some forgotten dust, between what we can influence and what is merely outside of our reach. The instinct, however, is always to worry about the vast expanse beyond that line. A sudden loud noise, an unexpected critique, triggers the old pattern, a panicked attempt to seize control over factors that have nothing to do with us. This struggle reveals a fundamental misunderstanding. We think self-mastery means gaining more influence, when in fact, it means gracefully acknowledging our limits. Acceptance is not passive resignation. It is an active refusal to fight against reality simply because we dislike what we find there. The path forward requires us to systematically dismantle these protective, yet restrictive, attachments, the need for external validation, the attachment to flawlessness. This involves a disciplined practice of anticipation. We are encouraged to mentally confront our potential failures, not out of morbid dread, but simply to deflate their power before they even materialize. By rehearsing minor setbacks, a lost document, a missed appointment, we strip them of their catastrophic charge. The fear remains, yes, but the terror diminishes, replaced by calculated preparedness. As we continue this process, our focus must narrow further. We must confront not just what happens to us, but what we are choosing to accept about ourselves in response to it. Self-acceptance proves far harder than avoiding criticism from others. It requires recognizing that simply showing up, imperfectly and continually, is the highest act of resilience. The final wisdom offered by these old philosophies is perhaps the most revolutionary. Freedom is an observational stance. It means creating a small, vital space between a stimulus and our response. When noise strikes, a harsh word, a demanding email, unexpected failure, we must refuse to jump immediately into judgment or defense. Instead, we simply pause. We observe. We become detached witnesses to the unfolding drama of life. This detachment is not indifference. It is clarity. It allows us to question the source of all our perceived distress. Is this a verifiable fact, or is this merely my emotional judgment placed upon an otherwise neutral reality? This shift in perspective fundamentally changes the trajectory of our lives. We stop being reactive figures pulled by the tides of circumstance and begin to become intentional agents, choosing how we process existence. This commitment to pause, this deliberate cultivation of thoughtful delay, is the true mastery. It is recognizing that life's challenges do not require us to be emotionless automatons, but rather self-aware navigators who treat every single day as a rigorous training ground for their own inner discipline. Philosophy ceases to be merely an academic pursuit. It becomes the muscle of intentional living itself. We have seen how much the external world dictates our emotional state. We react to noise, to criticism, to perceived slights. Our lives often feel like a continuous stream of defense mechanisms, a constant expenditure of energy, merely keeping pace with other people's expectations. But this exhausting cycle only continues as long as we are unprepared for what comes next. The wisdom we have encountered so far taught us that it is not the event itself that causes distress. It is our immediate judgment of that event. We tend to imagine the worst-case scenario, crafting narratives of failure and disaster before they even take shape. This habit of preemptive worry keeps us trapped in a state of manufactured anxiety. The next step, therefore, requires us to master not just the response, but the imagination itself. It is time for premeditation of trouble, Premeditatio Malorum. This ancient practice asks us to deliberately and calmly visualize our potential misfortunes, to imagine losing what we value, to anticipate failure in a small way, to rehearse disappointment. This might seem counterintuitive. Why would anticipating sadness make it less painful when it truly arrives? Because the act of contemplating the loss takes away its mystery and its raw shock. It forces us to look at misfortune not as an unexpected attack, but as a predictable event in the human experience. By making it imaginary now, we strip it of its overwhelming power. The goal is simply desensitisation. We are training our emotional muscle. When we rehearse these imagined hardships, say, losing a key project, facing rejection, or missing an opportunity, we move them from the realm of hypothetical terror into the realm of manageable theory. They become abstract possibilities rather than paralyzing certainties. Marcus understood this concept deeply. He began to apply it through visualization exercises, not with dread, but with cold, rational assessment. Imagine losing your job. What happens? The immediate emotional response is fear, a panic that everything will unravel. But when he mentally walks through the loss, he forces himself past the initial wave of terror. What are the actual concrete steps required after this simulated failure? You lose the income, but you still possess skills and a network. You have time to adjust. The problem shifts from the catastrophic emotional meltdown to a structured series of solvable challenges. He started by naming what he would miss most: the status, the routine, the perceived identity attached to his title. He wrote down these attachments, recognizing that these were not tangible losses, but rather agreements he had made with society about who he was supposed to be. By identifying these fragile, subjective assumptions, he could begin the process of unhooking them from his core self. The deeper realization dawned slowly. We are often more attached to our ideas of success than to genuine stability. We define ourselves by achievements, and when those achievements vanish in imagination, the perceived emptiness is enormous. It feels like a void where structure once was. But what does this exercise reveal? That even in loss, there is always inherent capacity for reinvention. There is always the residue of self that remains even after external scaffolding has been removed. The mind begins to observe itself during the imagined crisis. Instead of spiraling into uncontrolled worry, he learns to create a deliberate pause, a small gap of pure awareness between the stimulus, the loss, and his resulting emotional outcry. This space is where freedom resides. The power of Premeditatio Malorum is not in predicting doom, but in securing resilience. It is a philosophical vaccination against shock. When life inevitably throws us an unexpected curveball, a genuine setback, a misunderstanding, or financial hardship, we are not blindsided. We have already faced the shadow version of it within the quiet sanctuary of our own mind. The actual event becomes manageable because we have pre-trained ourselves to handle its basic architecture. This is training for endurance. It is accepting that life contains entropy, that things break, people leave, and circumstances change dramatically. By calmly rehearsing these inevitable declines, Marcus learns to greet reality with a steady hand rather than a panicked gasp. He transforms fear from a paralyzing gut instinct into a predictable calculation of necessary adjustments. The true meaning of premeditating trouble is not becoming morbidly prepared for disaster. It is cultivating an unshakable inner landscape so that the storms outside cannot shatter your core peace. It means understanding that while we cannot control what happens to us, we can meticulously rehearse how we will respond. And this conscious preparation is perhaps the most powerful act of self-mastery available to humankind. The habit of reaction is a profound thing. It governs our mornings and dictates the rhythm of our days. For so long, we have lived assuming that the moment an external event occurs, a sharp word, a forgotten item, an unanswered email, the corresponding emotional response must follow immediately. This pattern feels natural, inevitable, almost like breathing itself. Yet this constant linkage between stimulus and feeling is not living, it is merely reacting. The greatest exhaustion of modern life stems from this perpetual state of readiness. We operate under the belief that our worth is determined by our immediate usefulness or the perfect execution of our tasks. We have built lives atop mountains of expectations, external and internal, where any slip-up, no matter how minor, feels like a total collapse. And when we mistake these reactive responses for truly intentional action, we pay a heavy price, emotional fatigue. But to truly find freedom, the path must begin with stillness. It is in the silence between the stimulus and the reaction that the self can finally breathe. This journey back toward inner quietude requires us to question the foundational assumptions of our own minds. The noise of the world is designed to demand our immediate participation. It demands an instant reply, a quick agreement, or a defensive retort. We are trained from childhood to process life through reaction. Stimulus triggers response, and we believe this immediacy defines us. This habit of reactivity, however comforting in its speed, is profoundly exhausting. Our modern lives build on the shaky foundation of expectations of performance, perfection, and instant emotional compliance. When we mistake a reactive burst of emotion for measured, intentional action, we find ourselves perpetually drained, living under the weight of judging our own responses against an impossible ideal. The quiet moments of preparation are often the most profound. For years, my mind had been wired for reaction, an instant firing circuit designed to meet every demand placed upon it. We confuse readiness for action, mistaking the sheer speed of response for true capability. But I have learned that this constant state of alertness is not a mark of strength. It is simply a form of deep exhaustion. It is in these quiet intervals, moments between stimulus and choice, that philosophy reveals its power. It teaches us to build a pause, a necessary gap in the sequence of events. In that space, that intentional delay, we find the ability to choose our assent, the very foundation of our inner freedom. The challenge was never external. It has always resided within the swiftness and force of our own judgment. The world continues its relentless rhythm, notifications pinging, demands mounting, expectations swirling around us like dust in a drafty room. My old self would have snatched up the nearest thought, accepted it as truth, and acted immediately, allowing external pressure to dictate my emotional state. That quick, reactive surge felt authoritative, yet always left me drained, like a battery running on pure adrenaline without any true power source. I began to understand that many of the troubles we experience are not caused by the events themselves, but by the narratives we weave around those events. We do not suffer from hardship. We suffer from our mistaken judgments about what constitutes hardship. This realization shifted the focus entirely inward, moving it away from external battles and toward the fragile architecture of my own mind. The practice demands a radical detachment. It requires learning to view life's occurrences with the cool, objective eye of an observer. When someone makes a statement that immediately triggers anxiety or defensiveness, a perceived slight, an uncharitable word, my immediate impulse is still to engage, to defend, to feel the corresponding heat of wounded pride or justified anger. But I am learning instead to pause, to create distance between the noise hitting me and the response leaving my mouth. This deliberate gap is sacred ground. It is where I can ask myself a simple, yet monumental question. Is this feeling an objective fact, or is it simply my judgment about that fact? The external world, with its critics and its unavoidable disappointments, will always press against me. Some days, the pressure feels immense, threatening to shatter the nascent calm I have fought so hard to cultivate. It is easier, safer even, to just react, to let the familiar, emotionally charged current pull me under once more. But the reward for resisting that flow is a profound quietude. It is a quietude that does not imply apathy, but rather deep self-possession. I realize now that mastery is not about eliminating emotion, nor is it about becoming cold or unresponsive. It is about intentionality. It is about making sure my responses are thoughtful vessels of measured wisdom, carrying impact and calm, rather than being impulsive bursts of raw feeling. The cumulative effect of these small pauses, the refusal to assent immediately, creates a palpable ripple. The moment I cease my judgment on the external world's failures or criticisms, something subtle but undeniable shifts in the interaction. My measured response is not only received differently by others, it fundamentally changes the emotional landscape around me. The person who once saw merely a reactionary self now encounters someone whose pause has created a space of unexpected calm. They are met not with defensiveness fueled by panic, but with genuine consideration built on reflection. This quiet internal victory, this knowing that I controlled the response despite the trigger, is infinitely more satisfying than any external success. It is proof that my true locus of control resides within the unviolated sanctity of my own mind. And this realization informs everything else. True freedom, it seems, is not achieved by accumulating knowledge or professional accolades. It is forged in these minuscule moments of mental discipline, practicing separation and observation, until the instinctual reaction becomes merely another thought among many, and therefore easily dismissed. The ripple effect of that calm begins with the self, expanding outward to reshape every moment encountered. The journey toward inner peace has taught us a crucial distinction. We often assume that mastery means eliminating feeling or achieving a state of constant, blissful calm. But what if the true aim is something far more subtle, yet infinitely more difficult? It is not about being emotionless. It is about being intentional. It is about building a disciplined mindset that can guide us when life inevitably throws us off balance. Marcus realizes that the principles he has been studying, the great wisdom of the ancients, are not merely academic subjects to be read in quiet rooms, nor are they abstract theories confined to dusty scrolls. They are muscles. They are habits of thought that require daily, deliberate training. The grand challenge is transforming profound understanding into sustained action. He understands that self-mastery is not a destination reached through one heroic moment of insight. It is the cumulative weight of countless small, conscious choices made day after day. This shifts his focus entirely. His struggle changes from overcoming a single failure or responding to an immediate critique to sustaining a gentle, vigilant practice against the powerful gravitational pull of habit. The old ways of reacting, the instant spike of anxiety when faced with challenge, the desperate need for external validation, the tendency to treat setback as personal catastrophe, these habits are deeply ingrained and powerful. They are easier than thoughtful pause. Yet, true freedom demands that very effort. He must learn to inhabit a space between the stimulus and the response. That silent gap is where all agency resides. It is in this interstitial moment of reflection that he finds his power. The ancients teach us to view our emotions not as uncontrollable tides washing over us, but rather as passing weather. We are the observers standing safely on the shore, watching the storms pass. This requires developing a persistent detachment, a kind of gentle intellectual observation of one's own internal landscape. He begins to apply these methods systematically, recognizing that even the most benign daily routines offer unique opportunities for philosophical practice. Every interaction, every moment of waiting, every simple task becomes potential material for self-improvement. For example, when he receives an email that triggers his old pattern of anxiety, the expectation of criticism, the panic over perceived failure, he no longer plunges into it immediately. Instead, he practices a deliberate pause. He takes a few slow breaths and asks himself a challenging question. Is this feeling rooted in concrete evidence, or is it merely my judgment about an imagined implication? This simple shift changes everything. By consistently refusing to grant automatic assent to initial emotional judgments, he slowly weakens the grip of reactivity. This quiet retraining of the mind becomes his primary focus. He moves beyond simply managing acute crises. He begins to integrate this thoughtful discipline into the flow of everyday life itself. It is a deep and exhausting work because it requires sustained consistency. He understands that even on days when his effort feels minimal, or when he slips back into old habits and succumbs to quick judgment, these moments are not failures. They are simply data points. They show him where the training needs to be reinforced next. This commitment to daily, meticulous self-observation is what transforms wisdom from theory into lived reality. The accumulated power of these small pauses creates a profound, cumulative ripple effect, transforming his internal environment first, and subsequently reshaping every external interaction he has. He learns that true strength does not come from the loud declaration of competence or flawless performance, but from the quiet, reliable commitment to showing up for himself, to practicing awareness when it is most convenient to merely react. This sustained effort, this conscious rebuilding of mental habit, becomes the defining characteristic of his journey toward freedom. It is a gradual, persistent shift in perspective that transforms him from a perfectionist defined by fear into an individual defined by thoughtful presence and disciplined acceptance. The journey toward self-mastery is not a sudden epiphany. It is a commitment. It is the quiet accumulation of countless small, intentional moments. We have learned that our deepest suffering does not spring from the events themselves, the demanding email, the unexpected critique, or even genuine misfortune. Rather, it springs from the stories we tell ourselves about those events, the narratives we cling to, the story that failure means worthlessness, the story that approval is necessary for peace, the story that things must always be perfect. And this narrative building is exhausting. It requires us to operate in a constant state of emotional readiness, always anticipating the next blow or demanding validation of our current effort. We treat life as if it were a pass/fail test, and every interaction becomes a performance review against an imagined standard of excellence. This relentless pursuit of doing better creates a fatigue that no amount of sleep can remedy. The true challenge is not to achieve perfection. It is simply to maintain awareness, to notice the space, that tiny breath, the half-second pause between what happens and how we choose to respond. It is in that gap that freedom resides. We have practiced recognizing our judgment from simple fact. We know now that facts merely exist. A word was misspelled, a promise was broken, a person disagreed with us. These are neutral data points, but the judgment layered upon them, the verdict of this is terrible or I am incompetent, is what ignites the fire of distress. Self-mastery, therefore, becomes a relentless internal audit. It means asking again and again, is this fact, or is this merely my story about the fact? The training ground for this discipline is not some grand philosophical debate hall. It is the mundane rhythm of an average day. The morning rush, the crowded elevator, the predictable pattern of work communication. These small moments are where the massive effort must be deployed. Consider the act of opening your laptop in the morning. Before you allow yourself to dive into the cascade of notifications, the flashing screen demands, the urgent subject lines demanding instant response, there is a point of choice. A moment where you can physically stop and breathe. This pause is not laziness, it is resistance. It is choosing presence over reaction. The discipline requires translating these deep philosophical insights into muscle memory. We are training our nervous system to resist the old, comfortable habit of immediate emotional fallout. When an email arrives that triggers a familiar tightening in the chest, the feeling of inadequacy, the fear of missing something crucial, we must observe that feeling. We must label it. This is anxiety. This is the echo of yesterday's expectation. It is not necessarily reflective of today's reality. Observe your own emotional patterns as if you were a detached philosopher writing about a rare beast. Do not judge the panic. Simply catalog its appearance, its speed, and its trigger. Was it the sender? Or was it the internal assumption that this email must be perfect, demanding an equally perfect response? By identifying the root source of the urgency, which is usually our own need for validation or control, we strip the emotion of its perceived power. The commitment to self-mastery means embracing effort itself. It means understanding that every time we pause before reacting, we are not just solving a small conflict, we are strengthening a philosophical muscle. We are building resilience one intentional breath at a time. Sometimes, life will test this fragile new habit. A friend might recount a trivial mistake with unnecessary flair, inviting the old cycle of excessive concern. Or perhaps a colleague's careless word will strike close to a deeply held vulnerability. In these moments, the impulse will scream for the old reaction, defensive, wounded, rushed. But now we have a choice. We choose observation. We allow the words to simply fall into the space between stimulus and response. The goal is not emotional nullity. It is not about becoming cold or uninterested. Rather, it is about achieving intentionality, being fully present enough in the moment to respond with thought, measured curiosity, and genuine empathy, even when faced with chaos. We learn that true strength is not demonstrated by how powerfully we react, but by how calmly we choose not to. The practice becomes a constant questioning of our internal scripts. When we feel that familiar pull toward judgment, the question surfaces: does this need my immediate assent? Or can I simply observe it, allowing it to pass like a cloud across the sky? This is the quiet revolution. It is the decision, made daily, to owe ourselves the gift of a pause. This continuous effort, this refusal to default to reflex, defines the ongoing journey. Self-mastery is not a destination we arrive at. It is simply the committed process of showing up for ourselves, day after day, practicing the radical act of awareness. In the heart of modern life's noise, we have learned the profound power of the pause. We found that much of our suffering is not caused by external events, but by the story we tell ourselves about those events, the judgments we make in the immediate rush of thought. This realization was liberating, yet it brought with it a different kind of struggle, the difficulty of permanence. The modern world is designed for instantaneous reaction. It rewards quick pivots and decisive emotional responses. To pause feels unnatural, almost counterproductive. Our old wiring screams that stillness means falling behind, or worse, being ignored. The constant effort to control our reactions, to build that deliberate gap between stimulus and response, is exhausting. We treat self-mastery like a perfect achievement, as if we can simply switch off the emotional autopilot button. But life does not offer such simple on-switches. Life is messy, random, and fundamentally imperfect. And this brings us to the necessary conclusion of our study. Perfection is not the goal. Perfectionism itself is often merely an elaborate mask worn over a profound fear. The fear that if we allow ourselves even minor cracks, we will completely fall apart. We build towering expectations for our careers, our relationships, and even our own inner peace, believing that flawlessness equals worth. But true wisdom teaches us to embrace the breakage. It whispers that resilience is not defined by avoiding mistakes, but by how gently we rise after them. The pressure we put on ourselves to be perpetually optimal, to never misspell a word, to always deliver perfect results, to maintain an unwavering facade of competence, is itself a source of deep anxiety. We begin viewing imperfection not as part of the human experience, but as a character flaw that must be eradicated. The truth is far simpler, and perhaps much harder to accept. Humanity thrives in its beautiful inconsistencies. Our moments of genuine growth rarely arrive when we are operating at peak performance. They often surface after a stumble, following a moment where we had nothing left to prove. We have practiced the detachment from external judgments, the ability to observe criticism without immediately believing it, and we have honed the muscle of intentional response. Yet sometimes life simply presents us with something undeniably flawed. A project fails. A relationship ends due to misunderstanding. We fall short of our own elevated standards. The old voice whispers, "What does this mean about me? Was I not enough? Did I fail at being perfect?" This time, we must turn the lens inward and examine the myth of flawlessness. Marcus learns that his greatest battles have never been against external critics or chaotic commutes. They are fought in the quiet chambers where he judges his own imperfections too harshly. The concept is deceptively simple. To accept imperfection means accepting not just mistakes, but acceptance of one's ongoing, messy humanity. It is realizing that the capacity for error and the necessity of growth are two sides of the same coin. We are defined not by the clean lines of our greatest successes, but by the sheer tenacity with which we choose to keep showing up after a noticeable stumble. The struggle now becomes the profound internal shift from striving for immaculate existence to cultivating adaptive acceptance. It is moving beyond simply not reacting in stressful situations, toward genuinely welcoming the inevitable deviations, the missteps, and the inherent limitations of being human in an increasingly demanding world. We must learn that effort itself is more valuable than flawless outcome, that the attempt, the honest, messy, imperfect attempt, is where true character resides. This acceptance does not equate to resignation. It means recognizing that even when we fall short, we retain the ultimate sovereign power, the ability to choose our next action, to adjust, and to begin again without letting yesterday's failure dictate tomorrow's possibility. The path forward is therefore less about achieving a state of calm permanence and more about embracing perpetual motion, the continuous cycle of effort, stumble, learning, and rising once more. It requires the profound maturity to realize that our value does not fluctuate based on the polish of our achievements or the flawless nature of our performance. We are worthy precisely because we are flawed, because we strive, and because we choose self-compassion over impossible standards. This understanding is perhaps the most liberating truth a philosopher can offer. Healing begins at the point where we finally allow ourselves to be beautifully, wonderfully imperfect. The journey did not end when the sun rose over the water. That chapter of self-discovery was merely a turning point, an awakening from sleep, but not the destination itself. Marcus had learned how to pause. He had cultivated the necessary space between the stimulus and his response. Yet he knew deep down that pausing was not a solution. It was simply the recognition of a habit. The mind, after years spent navigating the currents of external demands, expected immediacy, a perfection, and decisive reaction. It found stillness instead, a quiet challenge to its entire operating system. He walked into his ordinary life carrying this newfound awareness, like a fragile, unfamiliar relic in a world built for speed. Every email notification demanded an instant judgment. Every casual comment held the potential for misinterpretation, triggering the old, reflexive knot of anxiety deep in his chest. The difficulty lay not in understanding philosophy intellectually, but in applying it moment by moment, breath by breath. The practice was relentless. It required showing up every morning and deciding to do the hardest thing, nothing. Nothing until he had questioned the underlying assumption. Was this irritation a fact, or was it his judgment about someone else's carelessness? This question became his daily shield, worn lightly but constantly against the sharp edges of expectation. He began to understand that self-mastery was not a grand epiphany delivered on a mountaintop. It was simply the cumulative weight of countless minor choices. It was deciding at what point of overwhelming pressure, the missed deadline, the critical email, the sudden disappointment, to take one deep breath and refuse the immediate emotional charge. To choose thoughtful response over panicked reaction. The initial commitment was exhausting. When he first questioned a criticism from a colleague, it felt less like an act of wisdom and more like physical labor. His old habits were strong, They were etched into him by years of high stakes and constant performance. He would feel the seductive pull of the knee-jerk reaction, the immediate defense, the instant rebuttal. But he learned to acknowledge that impulse simply as a pattern, observing it as one might watch clouds drifting across the sky, powerful, dramatic, but ultimately transient. The deeper realization was this: true emotional freedom is not found in becoming impervious to pain or disappointment. Rather, it is finding the reliable path back to center after being jostled by life's unpredictable forces. It is accepting that imperfection, in others and in oneself, is not a flaw to be corrected, but the fundamental material of the human experience. The stumble does not define the journey. The decision to stand up after the fall defines character. Marcus understood that he was no longer aiming for perfection. He was aiming for resilience. Resilience is the quality of bending without breaking, of yielding gracefully to forces stronger than oneself while retaining one's internal integrity. It meant accepting that sometimes the most skillful action was no action at all, simply allowing things to be, observing them without needing them to change. The path forward remains unwritten and uncertain. There will always be new challenges, misunderstandings, unexpected failures, and moments where the old reflexive emotional armor will tempt him back into the chaos. But now, he has a framework for recovery. He knows that even when things feel overwhelming, there is always room for one more breath, and in that pause resides his ultimate power. Philosophy, he realizes, is not the body of knowledge housed within dusty tomes. It is the perpetual act of showing up with curiosity, showing up with patience, and showing up day after day, simply committed to the process of becoming a little less reactive, a little more present.